Have you ever met someone they just don't compare to other people that you've met? Maybe it was a magnetic personality. Maybe it was the way that they focused in on you. Or maybe it was a generous spirit that you've never experienced before. Someone who absolutely captivated you. By meeting them, it was unlike anyone else. It's often the case that when you've met someone like that, they leave an impression, a deep impression upon you. And yet, what happens if you've met this incomparable person, that they're unlike anyone else, and you've failed them, you've disappointed them, you've fallen short of some sort of expectation that maybe you thought that they had? What's it like to meet that person then? Jesus makes an indelible impression upon those who follow him, those who are walking with him, those who are around him. He can heal a son who is about to die. He can turn water into wine and make a great feast at a wedding. He can walk on water, make loaves multiply so that the crowds can eat. He can heal a blind man, a lame man. He can raise the dead. This is the incomparable Jesus. And yet, what's it like for someone like Peter to meet the incomparable Jesus? Peter, you see, is this man. He can be a little brash at times. He can be quite forthright in what he thinks his opinions are. And he can be quite assertive. And he can even say, Lord, you will not die. I will die in your place. I will go. I will defend you. Because he's met the incomparable Christ. But in the moment of Jesus' darkest hour, in the hour of greatest difficulty, in the hour of pain and suffering, Peter can't even stay awake. He can't defend Jesus. And he can't even hold to his own confession of who Jesus is, denying him when asked 3 times, "Do you know this man?" Like Peter, I think that for each one of us, when we meet the incomparable Christ, we can see how amazing and wonderful and awesome he is. And yet, we can feel like we are major disappointments to him. That our lives haven't turned out the way that we had hoped. We haven't accomplished the things for Jesus that we thought. That we're not as great and wonderful and the great things for God that we hoped and thought that we would do. They just haven't panned out. And life has a way of causing us to look with a sense of suspicion on the incomparable Christ. I know he's forgiven me, but maybe he's just deep down still disappointed with me. Maybe he's reluctant. Maybe he loves me because he has to. And in this, we can know all of these doctrines and truths that Jesus forgives, he goes to the cross, and yet the radical experience of the incomparable Christ for you, it's missing. In John 21, we have one of the most beautiful chapters in this entire gospel. Now, there's all sorts of discussions that scholars make about why is this added on at the end, and it seems to be an appendix, and all of those types of arguments that scholars love to do. And yet, consistent with the themes of John, the patterns of John, the gospel, we see a Jesus who is consistent in this gospel from beginning to end. And as John 21 begins to wind down and gives us this little epilogue at the end, it's as though John, as the gospel writer, focuses on his witness to Christ and on Peter, whom we've had left a bit of a situation unresolved, a situation where Peter has been a disappointment, a failure, a betrayer, if you would, in the most extreme sense. And so there is now this resolution that begins to build in this final chapter. Peter has denied Jesus 3 times, and no doubt there are lingering doubts in his mind. His grace is able to banish sin, but is he able to love me? And into this, John invites us in those dark places with our little doubts, with our disappointments, with our uncertainties, and even our suspicions of what Jesus is like. And he breaks into that so that we might ask, is his grace sufficient for me? The disciples, you see this in this passage here, they don't want to ask the question out loud, but yet they have the question in their mind. They're wondering, who are you? We are told in verse 12. Who is this man? But this passage is intended to answer that question. Who are you? You see in verses 1 and 14 that John says that Jesus again revealed himself to the disciples. That's verse 1. And that this was the 3rd time that after his resurrection he revealed himself to his disciples. This passage is about Jesus revealing who he is. From the very beginning of verse 1 to verse 14, it's intended to reveal the very heart of Jesus, what he is like. Who is this Jesus? I want us to see 3 things that this passage reveals to us about who Jesus is. First of all, I want us to meet the sovereign Lord. Now, Jesus has instructed his disciples after his resurrection, go on to Galilee. There I will meet you. And here we are back in Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee, and here we have Jesus on the shore. The disciples are out fishing. In fact, Peter is the one who's initiated this. He's gone out fishing, and he's invited 6 others of the disciples to go with him. And as they go out, they spend the night fishing. Now, Peter, you have to remember, this is his job. This has been his livelihood. Probably his father was a fisherman. He's been trained to be a fisherman. He knows this lake. He's fished this lake. He knows the good spots. He knows the good places. He knows the good times. This is not something that is unfamiliar to him. He knows the weather patterns and how dangerous the Sea of Galilee can be. And he's out on this lake, and he's caught nothing. The expert, trained fisherman who has spent his life doing this very task catches nothing. And yet, as the disciples are close to shore and the sun is just starting to crack up on the horizon and light is breaking in, there's a man on the shore and he calls out to them, "Children, have you caught anything? Do you have any fish?" And the disciples answer, "No." It's been an unfruitful night. It's been an unproductive night. It's been a night of hard work, of casting the nets and hauling them back in with nothing to show for it. And yet, unbeknownst to them, is Jesus, the man on the shore, saying to them, "Cast your nets on the other side." This is the very care of Jesus, the sovereign Lord, who in this gospel, this is the only time he calls them children. This tender phrase, "Children, do you have any fish?" "No, cast your net on the other side." And when they do, they experience what they experienced the very first time. That when Peter met Jesus the very first time, we're told, when he was called to follow Jesus in Luke 5, Jesus had been teaching the crowds, and the crowds were pressing in on him, we're told in Luke 5, verses 1 and following. And so Jesus got into the boat, Peter's boat, and he told Peter, "Cast yourself out a bit." And so there he taught, as the crowds were pressing on the seashore, he taught from a boat. As he finished his teaching, he told Peter, "Take the boat out deeper. Let's go out a ways. Cast your nets." And they cast their nets, and we're told in Luke chapter 5 that the catch of fish was so great that it was breaking their nets. They had to get another boat to come and help them, and the fish were so plentiful that they were sinking because of the abundance of fish. And when Peter experiences this in Luke 5, verse 8, he says to Jesus, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." In his sovereign power, Jesus is able to speak a word and give plenty of abundance. The irony in the Gospels is that Peter and 3 others of the disciples are by trade fishermen. And yet Raymond Brown points out in his commentary on John that as much as they are fishermen, in the Gospels, the disciples never catch fish without the help of Jesus. Pros at fishing, apparently, but they can't even catch fish. And that takes our mind back to the very words of Jesus in John 15, where he said, "Apart from me, you can do nothing." John 15:5. They can't even catch fish. They need Jesus to help them catch fish. And here, just like the first time that Peter encounters Jesus in a personal way, he provides, he uses his sovereign power, and he gives Peter and the fishermen an abundance of fish. He meets you in his sovereign power, because this is the very nature of Jesus. His power is great. The Dutch Prime Minister and theologian Abraham Kuyper would say, "There is not 1 square inch of the universe over which Jesus did not say, 'Mine.' Every fish in the sea, every bird in the sky, every man and woman, this planet is his, over which he rules and reigns in his sovereign power." So meet the incomparable Jesus, the sovereign Lord, who speaks a word and fish jump into a net. But also, I want you to meet the servant of all. Now, if we just knew Jesus as the sovereign Lord in all of his tremendous might and power, our experience would be like that of Peter in Luke 5. "Depart from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." His sovereign power wouldn't woo us, but it would terrify us. It would cause us to shake. The same scenario as in John 21 happens in Luke 5. And the terror that strikes Peter in Luke 5 is great. But what is Peter's response now? It is not, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." Peter could, maybe even should say that. He's denied the Lord 3 times. This is according to John, this is Peter's first encounter with Jesus after the resurrection. Yet what is Peter's response? The net is full of fish. They're hauling it in. And John, the beloved disciple, he says, "I see the Lord. It's the Lord." And Peter, he's stripped down. He's taken off his outer cloak. He's been working all night. It's probably hard work, sweaty work. He doesn't want any encumbrances. He's pulling in the nets. He puts back on his robe. He jumps in, and we're told it's about 100 yards. And there's this incredible feat that Peter has. He's swimming to shore. He's pushing himself hard. He's like that Olympic swimmer doing 2 laps of the Olympic length pool to get to Jesus. And he does this incredible feat. And when he comes to shore, what does he find? Jesus is there cooking breakfast. There's some fish on a charcoal fire, along with some bread that seems to be freshly baked. Now, the last time that Peter was at a charcoal fire was in John 18, verse 18. And when he was standing around that charcoal fire, It wasn't just to warm himself, but it was also the scene of where he said that he did not know Jesus. It was the very place of his denial. And now as he is at this charcoal fire, there is a different encounter with Jesus. The first encounter with Jesus, the fishing boat in Luke 5 full of fish, it terrified Peter. The sovereign Lord struck fear into his heart. But now Peter's experience of Jesus is very different. He's watched him provide. He's seen Jesus make a wedding even a greater celebration. He's seen him heal a sick boy from a distance. He's watched the crowds be fed. Jesus coming to the disciples as they're rowing across the lake and struggling in the terror of night as Jesus walks on water. He sees Jesus give a lame man the ability to walk, a blind man the ability to see. A dead man walks out of a tomb. And so now how does Peter respond? This is the sovereign Lord in all of his power. And what does Peter do? John says, I see the Lord. It's Jesus. And Peter responds as he always does with that impulsive nature, gets his robe on, jumps in, and swims hard to shore. When we first encounter the sovereign Lord, in all of his power, it does terrify us. Our experience of power, it's unfortunately tainted by sin. It's tainted by a broken world. It's tainted because when we see power, we often see it abused. People use power for their own position and for their own advantage. It's why we're cynical of politicians, because we often associate power with lining your own pockets. But when Jesus uses his sovereign power, every example in the Gospel of John of Jesus' use of power is to serve others. It's for their good, to bring life, to bring healing, to bring restoration. And even now, as Jesus is on the shore, he is cooking breakfast. Mark takes the words of Jesus in Mark 10, verse 45, where he hears Jesus say, the Son of Man, Jesus' way of referring to himself, came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. He is the servant of all. He doesn't hold on to his power and keep it so as to have it for himself, but he uses his power to give it away. He uses his authority to bless. And this is the whole idea of Proverbs 11:24. That the one who has much and tries to keep lacks, but the one who gives away has so much more. And this is the very heart of God, the very heart of Jesus, the generous heart, the heart that gives. And he gives in a self-giving way. So great is his self-giving that he gives by even going to a cross and laying down his life for you and for me. That if by faith we respond, that we find that all of the benefits and blessings of the sovereign Lord's power is for us. It's for your good. It's for your joy. Jesus is the sovereign Lord. He can speak a word and 153 fish can jump into a net. He is the servant of all who comes and prepares a breakfast. But the third thing I want us to see is I want us to meet Jesus, friend of sinners. The disciples were told in verse 12, they've come to shore. Peter's got this, I don't know, it's an adrenaline rush. He's just pulling in the fish. He's swam the 100 yards, and now he's hauling in this net of 153 fish, large fish, we're told. And he's just using this Herculean strength to drag it in. And the disciples are there, and they're not wanting to ask the question, who is this? They don't want to ask that question. They've seen Jesus knows what's in a man's heart. We've seen that in John 2. He knew what was in men's heart. And so there's a hesitancy, it seems like the disciples, they don't want to ask. But there is Peter, the one who's denied Jesus, abandoned Jesus, failed Jesus. And he's rushed to shore. And if anyone ever had reason to be disappointed with the followers of Jesus, it's Jesus. If anyone has been betrayed, wounded, disappointed, denied, it's Jesus by his own followers. And how does Jesus respond? How does Jesus respond to someone like Peter who's disappointed him, who's failed him? Peter, come on, man. Where were you in my time of need? No. We're told that Jesus has prepared a breakfast of fish and bread, and it sounds just like what happened in the wilderness in John 6. When the crowds were out, they were like sheep without a shepherd, and they were hungry and they didn't have food. We're told that Jesus looked upon the crowds and he had compassion on them like they were sheep without a shepherd. And so he saw that there were 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he took those 5 loaves and 2 fish, he broke them, gave thanks, distributed it, and everyone had their fill. And now the very heart of Jesus that had compassion on the crowds looks into the very eyes of Peter with love and compassion to the man who betrayed him in the moment of need by denying him 3 times, who didn't stand up, though he tried to stand up, who swung a sword but who was so outnumbered, and who ran away, and who was seemingly afraid. Jesus looks at him, and he asks him to bring the fish that they've just caught, and says, "Come, have breakfast." What is Jesus creating? He's creating more than mere followers. He's creating friends. He welcomes and receives sinners. And the way that he welcomes and receives people who even disappoint, who fail, who fall short, is that he not only frees them from their guilt and their shame of their sin, but he calls them friends, friends of God. Jesus is able then to move into the deepest, darkest recesses of our hearts, the places that you and I don't even want to go. And Jesus goes there without guilting us or shaming us or embarrassing us. And he moves into those deep, dark places where you and I don't even want to go. Those places where we have suspicions. Could Jesus really love me? Could Jesus really forgive me? Could Jesus really use me? I've made a mess of this situation, of this life. And he comes to make friends of God by reconciling and restoring and redeeming. This is the incomparable Jesus. The sovereign Lord might strike terror in your heart, but the servant of all welcomes you with open arms because he is a friend of sinners. This is why I love that great hymn. Come, ye sinners, poor and needy, weak and wounded, sick and sore. Jesus ready stands to save you, full of pity, love, and power. Come, ye weary, heavy laden, lost and ruined by the fall. If you wait until you're better, you will never come at all. Would you come to Jesus? Run to him, flee to him, and find him there, ready to serve you, love you, befriend you. When you come to him, you find the tender heart of Jesus for broken, weary, and wounded sinners like you and me.